Hello, good afternoon. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Large Loads Working Group to discuss technical requirements. My name is Elena Kopolov-Alford, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, these materials are now available on the Large Loads Initiative page. You can get to that page by going to KISO.com. Navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top and selecting Policy Initiatives, and that'll take you to the main landing page. From there, you can either search or scroll down to the Large Loads Initiative page, and the latest documents will be at the top. And if you're looking for anything on the previous information session or anything that was previously on the Large Loads page, a lot of those documents are also now ported over here. Okay, so some housekeeping reminders and engagement best practices. A reminder that the call is being recorded for informational convenience purposes, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission, but we will post this recording in a few business days to that initiative page. And the meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives, and just please keep your comments professional and respectful as always. And please keep your comments brief, just refrain from repeating any points already made so that we can ensure that everyone has an opportunity to participate. And if you need closed captioning or the transparency viewer to see who else is on this call, those are located at the bottom of your WebEx screen. So raise your hand to ask a question. If you connected within WebEx or use the Call Me option, you can select the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. If you dialed in outside of WebEx and connected with a phone line, then you can press *3. And that'll get the hand into the question queue. And when you're unmuted on our side, give it a few seconds. Give it a few seconds to let it unmute you. It kind of cuts off a little bit. And then just state your name and affiliation before making a comment or asking your question. If you'd like, you can send a question or comment in the chat, and you just send that to all panelists. And if you need any technical assistance today, you can send a chat to our event producer at Inteller Events. Today's event producer is Tegan for most of this meeting. So our agenda for today, from here, I'm going to hand it over to Danielle for the background, and then Ibrahim will go over the technical requirements development process. And then we have Rahul Anilkumar and Wenchen Zhu covering the overview of the study plans and the large load technical requirements in other jurisdictions. And then we will go to the updates from utilities from PG&E by Wenchen Zhu, Manuel Avadano for SCE, Merdad Majidi for SDG&E, and Daryl Holmes for VEA. And then we will wrap it up with next steps. So here I'm going to be handing it over to Danielle Mills, Director of Infrastructure Policy Development.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks everyone for joining this afternoon. Looking forward to a good discussion and an update of what we have been doing with the Technical Requirements Working Group. If we go to the next slide, I did just want to provide a little bit of context of all of our work on large loads. As you have all noted, I'm sure large loads are a topic of extreme urgency and interest lately, especially with the emergence of artificial intelligence. But we also consider large loads to be more than just data centers and AI. So while data centers do present the largest use case, we're also looking at things like electric vehicle charging, electrification of building and industrial processes and agricultural processes, electrolyzers, and the like. So we are working through definitions of what constitutes a large load and what types of large loads we are working to manage and consider in the development of any new policy. But for now, we're looking at about 4.5 gigawatts of data centers in the current 2025-26 transmission plan, and forecasting in future transmission plans for increased data centers to about 1.8 gigawatts by 2030 and 4.9 gigawatts by 2040. And we do proactively plan for these types of large loads through our integrated planning process with the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission. We also have processes underway where we can update our transmission plan through the concurrence process and working with participating transmission owners. So we're always trying to stay ahead of any new demands for large loads, but aware that this is a really dynamic space right now, and that we are seeing increasing numbers of large load interconnection requests and service applications at the utilities. each month. So this is an issue that we're just really watching closely and trying to stay in front of. Next slide, please. We did put out an issue paper in late January of this year and have received comments on that. And one of the points that we tried to emphasize in that paper is that we do feel that we need to think through what some technical requirements may look like for various types of large loads. And so since October 2025, we've been working with an informal technical requirements working group that's comprised of participating transmission owners who have large load interconnection requests in their service area. And we've been really working to study and consider any new technical requirements that may be necessary. And then eventually we'll work on establishing where those technical requirements may take place, whether those should be added to the ISO tariff or to the individual utility tariffs. So that's the topic of conversation that we want to update you all on today. I did also want to provide a little bit of background and broader context to say that the ISO is also preparing a straw proposal for a stakeholder initiative that will include technical requirements, and an update from this conversation today and the work of the Technical Requirements Working Group, but will probably also address large loads co-located with generation, as well as potential transmission service offerings for large loads, in particular as we consider the need for speed to power for new large loads and data centers, and some of the emerging cost allocation questions that come out of those issues. So for the sake of today, we'll be really focused on the Technical Requirements Working Group and providing an update from that group, but did want to put that in the broader context to say that this will be an ongoing conversation that will be included in the straw proposal and any additional papers or proposals that we put forward as part of the broader large loads initiative. And I can take questions from there if there are any questions on the broader context, but I think otherwise we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so if there are no questions, then I'll hand it over to Ebrahim to give a little bit of background on what the Large Loads Technical Requirements Working Group has been doing over the past several months. Thanks, Ebrahim.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Elena. As mentioned earlier, I'll go through that Large Load Technical Requirement Work Group. What's the objective of this group? What is the process we are following to come up with these requirements? And also at a very high level, what is the timeline? Next slide, please. As Daniel mentioned, this is an informal group formed mostly with PTOs that have transmission connected large load interconnection requests. And the idea of this group is that there are lots of discussion around the industry on technical requirements for large load. And the intent is that we collectively come up with these requirements. I mentioned a few of them here, like voltage and frequency right-through requirements is mentioned extensively. The limit on rapid ramping of the load and pulsating load, power quality, harmonics, voltage variation, as well as at the end, as we study these, what's the modeling requirement, study methodology, how we assess the large load when they go into commissioning and later they comply with those requirements. So at a high level, our approach is obviously reviewing existing technical requirements, other jurisdictions. Wenchen and Raul later will go through detail of the review that was done by the team. And that's one step. The other aspect is some of these requirements is not the same in all jurisdictions. Some of them are very similar, but some of them are very jurisdiction dependent, obviously depending on the characteristic, the size, the location, and what other network equipment are in nearby to these large loads and the type of large load. These requirements could be different. So the team is running a parametric study to help to draft the CAISO specific requirements, depending on what is applicable to CAISO. So those are kind of the next step we are working on. Next slide, please. So although this team is coming up with these technical requirements, But at this point, the kind of regulatory framework of how these requirements will be documented and where, how will be enforced will not be decided at this point. The whole idea for us is to come up with those requirements to ensure system reliability. And then at a later stage, a decision will be made that where we need to document them. Is it ISO or PTO or utilities, interconnection handbook, tariff, BPM, so on and so forth. The decision will be made at a later stage. One point we mentioned in the issue paper and earlier presentation is definitely the technical requirements this team comes up with needs to consider the direction NERC is taking on kind of a national standards. A couple of weeks ago, NERC had a technical conference on large load, and it was over 2 days. A lot of discussion happened. But I want to highlight 2 points here. That one is NERC is planning a large load level 3 alert in May-June timeframe. Those familiar with NERC alerts, level 3 is kind of essential action. They are kind of a call for action and so on. We'll know more when it comes out and we collectively draft our responses. But that's something coming up, and we provides us a lot of kind of a direction on what NERC is thinking and helps us as we draft the requirements. And another one is NERC is planning to develop a technical standard on large load, mostly computational load, like AI training, cryptocurrency, crypto mining load, and kind of conventional data center. And they are planning to initiate draft and submit it to FERC for approval by end of 2026. So definitely this group is aware of these initiatives and will follow and will be engaged at some capacity with these to ensure we are aligned our requirements with what will be eventually coming up as part of NERC. But the overarching objective of any technical requirements is striking the balance between system reliability and implementation feasibility. If it's too restrict, obviously the system reliability will be definitely preserved, but there is no technology available to meet those strict requirements. On the other hand, if we just consider feasibility of connecting and so on, only that, then there could be some risk to system reliability. Everybody, everyone working on this, coming up with technical requirements, is trying to balance between the two, based on the understanding and also based on the feedback they receive from the stakeholders. Next slide, please. Next few slides, I'll go very high level, just kind of mentioning the name and what it is, and then Wenchun and Rahul will go through a lot more detail of how we are planning to coming up with these requirements and how everyone else around the industry is coming up with those. But it's just I'm touching base at a very high level. So voltage right-through requirement definitely is one major topic in many jurisdictions. And we all know that computing equipment within inside data center at that kind of a basic level, they follow a kind of IT curve, right-through curve to protect the equipment. However, when it comes to kind of transmission system and system reliability, we need to voltage right-through requirements are needed to ensure large load continue to draw power from the grid during and following grid disturbances, typical grid disturbances. So there is a link to a report by ESIG, and there are 8 different entities that they have their own voltage right-through requirements. And as you can see, they're all different. We are not going to go through detail of those, but that shows that it's not like one size fits all. To ensure that balance is maintained between feasibility and reliability, every system, the requirement could be slightly different. So next slide, please. One aspect is post-fault active power recovery. Large load, excuse me. When a severe fault happens, obviously any equipment cannot continue to operate normal. So when severe fault happens, they are allowed to reduce their power consumption depending on severity of the fault. However, when the fault is cleared and voltage returns to normal, there needs to be some requirements that the power consumption from the grid should recover to close or close to pre-disturbance levels within a given time. So again, this is will be discussed later, but that's one of the aspects the team is working on. What should be a requirement for CAISO system? Next slide, please. Ramp rate limit maximum megawatt per minute. The power consumption of large data centers could vary significantly from 1 minute to another. So it could be 10–20% of the nameplate to 80–90% in a few minutes. And if you consider many projects operating at the same time, that ramp rate could be overall as a kind of a group or cluster could be quite high. So to manage the load and generation balance in real time, regulation services will be needed to maintain that balance. So we need to specify a maximum per minute limit on ramp rate to manage the need for regulation services, so that it's not like we need a lot more to be able to maintain the balance. And also, as a secondary effect is when the frequency excursion goes beyond that deadband mentioned, 36 megahertz, all the generators across the interconnection will respond to that. So we try to avoid frequently entering that kind of beyond the deadband. So as the large load data center will operate, we'll start seeing the entire generation fleet responding to those variations. So those are a couple of them that we are considering as we are developing this limit. Next slide, please. Limit all pulsating load level. There are many different names that call it pulsating. Some they call it high frequency kind of oscillations and different names. But the bottom line is, in addition to minute by minute variation we discussed earlier, AI training, especially AI training data center loads, could potentially have significant load variation in sub-second time frame. Within hundreds of milliseconds, they may go from 10–20 to full load, kind of within a short time frame. We call it pulsating. It could be different names, but that's the nature of how these operate at the computational level. So if we have a lot of pulsating load and many projects in close proximity doing that, it could have negative impact on power quality and also potentially result in torsional interaction with nearby synchronous generators. So we need a limit on that. Again, more detail coming up later. Next slide, please. So what we discussed earlier in the slide, and there are more phenomena that as we move along, we look into other aspects of large load impact on the system. But no matter what phenomena we are looking into, we need modeling data requirement and a study methodology. How are we going to study it? How are we going to, what tools we're going to use to study? What information we need to ask from interconnection customers? And if the information is not available, what assumptions we have to make? That's a big component of the whole process of studying, onboarding, interconnecting, operating a large data center load in the system. So for study engineers, certain aspects of dynamic performance of data center load could be modeling positive sequence tools like PSLF, like CMP-EV1 dynamic model load, and very soon, if not already, PERC-1 model. They can capture some aspects of dynamic performance of the load. Beyond that, we may need detailed EMT models and analysis in some area, if in certain areas that the system it doesn't have enough strength compared to what is connected to, or if a large data center load is close to synchronous generation and there is a risk of torsional interaction. We may require EMT models and studies as part of that. Next slide, please. So, like I said, those are a few things we are working more detailed in next presentation. But For the next step of the large load technical requirement work group, we continue to be engaged on NERC large load work group, ESIC large load task force, ERCOT and other entities. They kind of already published technical requirements and they're updating that and so on. We engage with those processes. And a parametric study will be performed to identify ISO-specific requirements on any of those. And as Danielle mentioned, there is a straw proposal is planned in next couple of months. We are thinking if we reach a point that technical requirements could be, some of them at least will be included in that straw proposal. And also we are targeting a public session like the one we are having now, focused on technical requirements. But in next one, we are targeting to have participation from data center developers, some of your interconnection customers, and also end users, the entities that will use those data centers for their process. Tentatively for May, June timeframe, depending on availability and so on. This is my last slide. I don't know if there's any question, comments we can discuss at this point.
Ibrahim? We have no hands in the queue, and there are no questions in the chat.
Okay. So before I hand it over, then Wenjun and Raul, then I just want, as I mentioned, this is kind of a work group. We have participation from PTOs and appreciate their effort. I just want to specifically, before handing over, PG&E mention their involvement in this process and having their consultant available and help us, the whole team in this process, running the studies and helping us with the review and so on. We acknowledge and appreciate their support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ibrahim. Okay, we're going to hand it over to Wenchen Zhu and Raul Anilkumar.
Okay, I will get this started. Thank you, Abraham. Yeah, so I just want to provide a PG&E context for this presentation, right? So, yeah, could you move on to next page? So PG&E has received, right, a large amount of data center load interconnection requests in the past 2 to 3 years, right? So, so these started to come online in 2025, and then the amount will ramp up in the next few years and continuing on the expectation, right? So, as the data center type of load, the amounts increase, right? The impact to grid reliability also increase. So this is really, right, a real concern for us for PG&E footprint. So, so technical requirements is certainly an important aspect, right, for interconnecting large loads, including data center loads. So in this effort, PG&E has been collaborating with CAISO, particularly in CAISO Large Load Technical Requirements Working Group. We have been working with Raul from Denova Energy Solution. Raul is an industry expert in this area, so we're glad to be able to work with him on a lot of issues. So we do have regular discussions with Abraham and others at PG&E. We also exchange ideas with other PTO members, right, in the CAISO Large Load Working Group context. So technical requirements, this effort, right, so we are approaching it in 2 parallel paths or approaches, 2 parallel paths. One is we're researching, benchmarking industry practices, what others already established, right? So So things change actually pretty quickly. So industry has been learning, but some other utilities, they had large amount of data centers before we did, right? So learn from other utilities, ISOs, what requirements they have established, right? So we can learn from it and probably use some of the information as a starting point, right? So that's the benchmarking, that's the first pass. Second is perform certain stability analysis, right? To do some sensitivity analysis and then confirmation, etc. to eventually arrive at a set of technical requirements that could work for PG&E and also for CAISO, and could be referenced by other PTOs at CAISO, right? So that's that's how we are approaching this task, technical requirements, without further delay, right? So I will hand it over to Raul for the rest of this presentation. Thank you.
No, thank you, Wenjin, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. And what I'll try and do over the next couple of minutes is just walk through two related efforts. So the PG&E team has been working very collaboratively to really build this structured framework for really defining any starting point technical requirements for large transmission connected loads, given again the focus on the CAISO system. That's the first aspect of what I'll be discussing, which is really the study plan and how we plan to approach this. The second aspect is really how some of the other transmission providers, to Wenjin's point, have been addressing this issue. One thing that's becoming very clear is that this is a very evolving space. And so what you see as a requirement today is likely going to be modified when you go into the next year. So how do you really think about a study plan that can be flexible enough so that these requirements are keeping pace with everything that changes, from the technology to the grid conditions? All of those were a lot of thoughts that went into consideration while PG&E was building the study plan. And so we'll spend some time talking about all of that. But just to help set the stage here, this study again is focused on developing very system-specific interconnection requirements for CAISO's grid. We know that there is a very different type of load that is out there from the traditional industrial loads. The loads we're talking about now are power electronics dominated, very controllable at sub-second timescales, and in this part of the system that we're looking at, very geographically concentrated as well. And so operationally, everything is very dynamic rather than steady state in terms of just the profiles of these loads. Now, historically, all of the large loads were very passive from a dynamic standpoint. That's not to say that there weren't these swings that you would see between summers and winters, but then there was a more traditional expectation of a slower ramp, more limited sub-second variability, and more generally connected systems through typical disturbances, right? But now we see that as we are beginning to cluster, as the amounts are increasing, in combination, they are having impacts on all of the items that really Wenjin and Ibrahim spoke about earlier, which is your post-fault voltage recovery. What exactly is the impact if you don't stay connected during a fault? So the study is really intended to kind of quantify some of these risks without really assuming that something that we see somewhere else is going to be directly applicable to us, which it very well might be, but we want some of our studies to help us arrive at that answer. If you could move to the next slide, please. Perfect. So just to additionally provide some context, we are really focusing on these 4 areas for now. One is voltage write-through. The other one is frequency write-through. Then we also have active power ramp rate and modulation. But I think the most critical one, which is really the aggregate clustering effects. Each of these categories address a very distinct kind of reliability mechanism, if you will. And the objective is to use more simulation-based and operational information that we have to determine whether we need to really establish any performance envelopes. And if so, what exactly and at what level are those envelopes going to be established? If you could move to the next slide, please. So there are really four overall principles, let's just say overall study philosophies. The first one is really the requirements should be supported by very KAISO-specific system modeling. We definitely want to avoid being very conservative, but when we are looking at what the system response is going to be, some amount of conservatism or margin is always required. So all of the thresholds as well that we arrive at are going to be simulation driven. And most importantly for us, the entire methodology should be reusable as the system conditions evolve. Because if there's one thing that's certain, it's looking at everything that some of the peer utilities have been observing and exploring. The requirements are continuously evolving. And as much as we'd like to say that this is the final set of requirements that are applicable, we need to be prepared for all of those tweaks as we continue to evolve into the future. We can move to the next slide, please. I'll just do a little bit of a deep dive into all of the different phases. Now, really phase one is where we begin with benchmarking against some of our peers. There's ERCOT, SPP, Dominion, ATC, which is in MISO, Southern Company, and we've also got Long Island Power Authority, which actually just released a fantastic set of requirements about 2 or 3 weeks back. So we'll very briefly talk about that as well. And the purpose is, again, not to like replicate their standards, but to really identify which are the core requirements that are being formalized. Are we overthinking that we need right-through requirements, or are right-through requirements common across all the different utilities? Also, where really we have some types of quantitative thresholds that are emerging. How really is some of this performance being enforced and monitored? Now, when we evaluate some of the transferability of all of this to the KAISO system, we keep in mind that these are some of the best practices that have gone through at least a year or two of being developed and also being rigorously tested through a stakeholder process. And so we have some of the best practices to start from. And once we're done with this presentation, we will be talking about this in a little bit more detail. We have a couple of slides to cover this. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Over here, we talk about the voltage right-through study. That was phase 2 of what effort we were focusing on. Over here, we're really targeting what the large load response would look like during and after transmission faults. So our simulations include everything from single line to ground, line to line, 3-phase faults. We're going to be looking at normal and delayed clearing. We're going to be looking at reclosing events. Reclosing events, again, are very critical in light of what played out in Dominion, which has made its way into some of the NERC incident reports that you might be familiar with. All of the events documented there were data center responses in reaction to reclosing events that happened on Dominion system. And for each of these scenarios, some of the items that we are quantifying is really the magnitude of load loss, the voltage recovery profile, what some of the generator angle stability looks like, and also some of the Q margins that we're observing. What is really the reactive part support looking like? We are seeing this theme of larger data centers being also required to install STATCOM devices wherever they are interconnecting to the high voltage system. That serves several dual purposes, most likely to curb during high voltage excursions and also providing some kind of dynamic VAR support, because past events have shown that when the data centers strip out, there is a natural overvoltage that happens. Sometimes operator action to switch off those cap banks can be delayed. And so you have extended periods where the system is operating at extra high voltage. And so dynamic support becomes necessary. And so these are things that we want to explore and really see whether they fit the needs of the system that we are focusing on. And again, just pointing out that the objective is to really determine the voltage time envelope that is necessary to prevent any disturbance-driven load disconnection from materially degrading any of our system recovery. And so it's not really an analogy or an analogy for like the generator right-through curves, but this is ultimately what we want to try and translate this into. And that's a common theme in everything that you see in other utilities and ISOs as well. If you can move to the next slide, please. Very briefly, just want to touch upon the frequency right-through study as well, because that is another third phase. So if you think about a right-through envelope, there is a voltage component and there's a frequency component. Now, the frequency component can go into several layers of depth. There's a rate of change of frequency, and there's several components in how you can translate this into a requirement. But for purposes of this study, you can think of it as simulating everything from loss of some of the larger loads that we have interconnecting in the system, loss of major generation resources, trying to understand what is the frequency decline to nadir, trying to understand what is the interaction with UFLS set points that we have in the system. So two aspects are really critical over here: whether the load trips during these frequency excursions and how and when the load reconnects when the frequency restores. You can think of that as something similar to what we will be looking at on the voltage side as well. But for this, we are seeing a common theme of starting with the PRC 029 standards and then seeing how those need to be tweaked for the large loads, and then soliciting feedback whether some of the requirements that come from the PRC standard can actually, even though designed for more inverter type of generation resources, can also be met by data centers. Those are things that we're going to be exploring as part of this effort. If we can move to the next slide, please. Great. So phase 4 is where we're really looking at ramps rates and the pulsation assessment. And this was briefly touched upon by Ibrahim as well. So we're really looking at operational variability over here. We know that the large electronic loads introduce step changes in their active power. They have some of these sustained ramps over several minutes. There are a lot of sub-second modulation patterns. Now, all of these can interact with your governor response, your governor droop settings, your local plant controls, inter-area oscillatory modes. There is a little bit of a blend of what we would do as a balancing authority to manage the ramp rate limits on a minute or a 5-second, let's say, basis, but also what we see in terms of like what the sudden high frequency ramps are going to be doing in introducing forced oscillations into the system. So there's a component of it that comes from just the balancing authority and area control error and the 0.036 hertz, all of those settings that we have before we trigger primary frequency response in our system. And also this component of just high frequency pulsating loads and the dynamics that they introduce at a subsynchronous level into the broader grid that interacts with other generators and other large loads. So these are things that we are exploring right now as part of this study as well. And we will be trying to look at what some of those ramp rate limits are as they are guided by the mix of both of these. One aspect of it really coming from more of like the balancing authority perspective, the other aspect of it really coming more from a forced oscillation injection perspective. If you can move to the next slide, please. Now, in order to really run all of these studies, there was a lot of work, like Ibrahim and Wenchin had pointed out, that went into finding what the right models are and how do you really represent some of these elements in your positive sequence modeling, as well as when do you pull the trigger for a more detailed EMTP type of model. So for all purposes now, we're going to be running a lot of the analysis using positive sequence models. We are treating the known electric vehicle model in PSLF as a data center and modeling some of the dropout and recovery characteristics of the data center based on information that, as you're aware, PG&E did establish one of the first cluster study processes and really at the forefront of collecting a lot of the really good data, helping look at some of that and translate that into our dynamic model, which helps model the behavior of them tripping out, reconnecting with a certain amount of delay or more instantaneous, which takes away some of the disadvantages we have with our more traditional models. And so we also are aware, like Ibrahim had pointed out, that there is a PERC 1 model that is going to be endorsed as the model to represent power electronic interface large loads going forward in all studies. There is a NERC load modeling guideline focusing on that report that is on that model that's going to be out, I think, in the next quarter or so. And that's going to provide more guidance on how to use that model. But for now, in the interest of time, we are using the EV load model because we believe that there is a good enough correlation in what we can parameterize. So that's the approach for now. And where available, we will also be using the high resolution power quality, the P and the Q measurement data that has been collected as part of the interconnection process to really understand what do we need to translate some of those oscillation counts into, right? Whether we need to run an FFT analysis to really find out what the distribution of the frequency spectrum looks like and how that correlates to existing oscillation modes in the system. Those are all things that are all in the pipeline, but we are trying to make do with the best available modeling information and the recommended practices from NERC and the rest of our utility partners to really see how to move this forward. Now, if we could go to the next slide, please. Just focusing on ultimately what we think the deliverables are going to look like out of this effort. The outputs will include a recommended write-through curve for both the voltage and the frequency. There will also be a ramp rate screening criteria that we are likely going to be developing as part of this process. That could take different shapes. It could even be a ramp rate limit, but that is something that is being explored by the group. But more importantly, we are also going to be building a reusable study methodology because the intention and the kind of work is going to likely need to be reused or redone whenever there are changes in the technology that we are focusing on. So one last thing that I'll just provide is there is still a lot of there is still an ongoing discussion about how these requirements get applied, but ultimately it is a part of your FAC compliance. And so there is some work that is going to get added from a lot of this work into the tariff and the interconnection handbooks. And those are things that will be explored as part of this effort as well. Now, for the next set of slides, we shift focus a little bit to now with everybody understanding what the CAL-ISO specific framework is, summarizing how some of the other utilities are addressing very similar challenges. So this section, again, is going to look at different topics. And now how we selected these categories and topics is something that I'll just spend a minute on. So if you can move to the next slide, please. Across all of the different regions, we saw that there were these, let's say, 6 categories that well, let's say 5 categories for now that have more defined themes and directly relate to what Ibrahim had presented earlier. We seem to be converging into these 5 requirements, but there are also others, which is category 6, which are certain nuances that apply, I'd say, more broadly to everyone, but don't fit the bill of like a standard definition, right? And I think the most notable shift that we are seeing is from more discretionary kind of study-based evaluation towards more defined performance envelopes and very measurable type of criteria. So what that really means is when we were used to looking at things from an interconnection study perspective and on a case-by-case basis, making a call out whether this performance is right or this performance is wrong, I think that discretionary study-based evaluation has now pivoted more towards requiring such kind of performance envelopes that you can really measure against, because now the impacts have moved beyond a single point and to a broader system. If we move to the next slide, please. Great. And so I'll start off with the voltage and frequency right through. Now, we've definitely tagged who is the entity that is proposing these requirements over here. So I'm not going to be going into each one of these in details, but the right through obligations really require the facility to remain connected during very specified voltage and frequency excursions, right? They're increasingly being defined with either explicit low voltage and high voltage right through curves or frequency right through curves. They're also being defined with like Rohkoff tolerance thresholds if you think about the frequency. Another component to it is, if you think back to what happened with the Dominion event, there is a multiple event survivability required within short windows, right? What that means is that you need to be able to write through at least 6 automatic reclosing actions or 3 automatic reclosing actions based on the local utilities reclosing practices. Like in AEP, you don't commonly find 3-shot reclosing, you find 2-shot reclosing. So in their requirements, you're going to see it written up as, if you consider the double reclosing shot, then 4 automatic reclosing events. But if you look at Dominion, where they have 3 reclosing shots, then it's going to be 6 automatic reclosing events. So you see some of these nuances play out, right? Again, telling you that all this is very system specific. Now, another thing to quickly add over here is you might notice here that in few places we have said curves, like explicit right through curves, and in few places we have said requirements. So the curves are really what you see on the voltage versus time kind of axis, what you're used to generally seeing in your PRC curves and all of those. That's where you end up seeing a curve. And we have ERCOT, we have Southern Company, and if you can move to the next slide, please, we have ATC and MISO, all of these folks, and even LIPA, which was a new requirement that actually released about 2 or 3 weeks back. even they've got explicit write-through curves. Along with those write-through curves, they've also got the requirement, which is what you see, for example, in AEP in Dominion, where you are basically requiring that you need to write through 2 consecutive voltage excursions. And they also specify voltage bands within which you need to be writing through the event. And the way that these write-throughs are being formalized and evaluated are through a pretty rigorous kind of stakeholder process. A lot of studies are driving what this threshold looks like. If you look at ERCOT's case, the entire write-through curves and the envelopes were designed based on when you have the loss of load event, you are causing a frequency excursion to cause a lot of the generators to hit their high frequency operating limits. And so you had a lot of generators starting to trip out. And so those kind of analyses have resulted in guiding the curves and what they end up looking like. So that's on the voltage and the frequency right through. And this presentation deck at the very end, there is a supplemental appendix which goes into more details of what these curves look like and how they were arrived at. If you can move to the next slide, please. The post-fault active power recovery is another kind of critical one. So some of the recent requirements not only focus on whether the load stays connected, but also how it recovers, especially the active power after a disturbance. And 2 failure modes are typically evaluated over here. One is what really happens if there is an excessively delayed recovery, right? Which kind of traditionally would prolong the depressed voltage condition and would likely just impede restoration as well. And then what happens if you have an aggressive step recovery, which can really increase like the reactive demand very abruptly and also delay voltage stabilization depending on what part of the system you're operating with. And especially in more kind of these power electronic dominated loads, the restoration of megawatts can be extremely rapid depending on some of their control settings. But fully recognizing that if it is a more delayed fault, then they have gone to their UPS and backup systems, and for them to reconnect from the UPS and backup is going to take them some time. That's where some of the modeling that you are looking at with the EV model, the electric vehicle model, or the PERC-1 model really allows you to capture some of these phenomena. And another thing that's also being done is just looking at more aggressive kind of ramping from 0 to the full output, just to understand whether that kind of an event mimics something that you would see if you were to lose a generator, which of course has its own impacts on the frequency. And we're always used to thinking about under frequency, but how do we now start thinking about over frequency, right? And those are some of the things that as part of the study and all of the write-through curves as well as the recovery post-fault, those are phenomena that will be explored here. This is again relevant in weak grid areas where voltage recovery margins are extremely tight and your reactive resources are already constrained. If you can move to the next slide, please. Perfect. Yeah, and this again, so the way that the slides are kind of set up is for each of these topics or categories, we cover the feedback of all of the different utilities and where their requirements are. One common theme with the post-fault active power recovery is the return to 90% of pre-disturbance consumption within about 1 second after the voltage recovers to pre-fault values. Maybe not even to pre-fault values, but at least to like 0.9 per unit. That's a very common theme that we see in terms of a post-fault active power voltage recovery requirement. There are other utilities that require the same thing, but in a very different kind of fashion. So if you look at ATCs, for example, they are looking for post-fault recovery within 3 cycles after the fault is cleared. They don't specify what voltage threshold beyond which you need to recover. So you can think of that as either flexibility or non-flexibility, depending on the type of system that you're operating with. So these are some of the things that we are trying to define as part of the work that we're doing as well in our study plan. If you can go to the next slide, please. Perfect. Now we'll very quickly talk about the ramp rate requirements. The ramp rate requirements, again, limit the maximum rate of change of active power at the POI. That's really the point of interconnection where the data center is connecting and where likely most of the measurements are going to be made. These are typically defined in megawatt per minute value, megawatt per second value, and they are evaluated over a rolling time window. Now, there's also a distinction where you have these ramp rate limits that apply during normal operation, and there are certain exceptions under emergency conditions. Now, what exactly is that emergency condition is that definition varies as well, but it gives you a sense of how expansive some of these requirements are. Now, the purpose again of any ramp rate kind of limit is more operational stability, limiting the burden on the AGC and the governor response. And so we know that the large electronics loads can change their consumption much faster than a thermal unit's ramp capability. So that can potentially induce area control error excursions if they're not really bounded, right? And that's where the 0.036 hertz limit came into our discussion a little bit earlier as well. If we can move to the next slide, please. Just deep diving a little bit into what these requirements look like. Over here, there is an instantaneous step change limit, and there's also a sustained ramp rate limit over a defined interval. So ATC, for example, if you look at it, they have a limit where you must limit the amount of repetitive active power changes within 25 megawatts over a 5-second rolling or sliding window interval. Then any active power change greater than 50 megawatts must be limited to less than 0.5. So that's kind of the ramp limit that they want you to take, which is 0.5 megawatts per second. And there are some plots on the very end as well that do more justice to this than my explanation. But I think the key intention here is to really tell you that these are all of the different flavors in which these requirements are taking shape. Right, and you look at LIPA as well, they have the similar 20 megawatt per minute requirement, and that has a 60-second period. While this presentation says that for ERCOT, there is no requirement, I think about 2 weeks back, it was actually presented at one of the ERCOT working groups. They are thinking about 10 megawatt sliding window requirement over 5 seconds. And there is some feedback as well on how they arrived at those numbers. It seems to be derived by a combination of mostly forced oscillation induction into the system, while also taking into consideration the impact on area control error. If we can move to the next slide, please. Excellent. So this is again the oscillations piece, and need to clearly distinguish between like the ramp rate limits and the oscillations. So the ramp rate limits, again, it's good to think of that as more supporting kind of your balancing authority responsibilities as an area. But given how you define your ramp limits, whether they go down to the second level or the intra-minute level, somebody could make an argument that you're also going to directly influence oscillations. So this has to be very clearly outlined. But in essence, I think what the oscillation requirements are really outlining are that large loads should not introduce or amplify any of the inter-area oscillation modes, any of the local plant modes, any of the torsional frequencies of generators in your vicinity. So some jurisdictions straight up kind of prohibit any type of negative damping in the 0.1 to 55 hertz, which is your subsynchronous range. And that's a pretty broad range. And so a lot of times the feedback comes back, which is, even within the subsynchronous range, I mean, what frequency should we be avoiding, right? And so there are different ways in which these oscillation requirements are being described and discussed. But again, they are very system specific and also very generator specific, because different generators could have different torsional interaction modes. And that's, again, a very common theme when you just think about the broader VEX system as well, and any other system in the Eastern Interconnect. Now, traditionally, these studies are being performed on the gen interconnection side and on the load interconnection side on a more kind of case-by-case basis. And it is going to be quite exhaustive to really be able to run these kind of studies for all of the large loads as a cluster, because the tools that you need, like your EMT models, are not really going to be able to handle that. So then the question becomes, can you enforce a requirement that more broadly applies across the board so that you can continue to just monitor the requirement being satisfied rather than having to trigger these studies for every single interconnection request? So those are things that are being explored in the oscillation space. If you could go to the next slide, please. Great. And I'll again point you folks to kind of LIPA's requirements, because they go, so you'll see this in two flavors, right? Let me say that. So the LIPA's requirements go into a lot of depth of telling you exactly what frequencies to avoid and what magnitudes to limit your frequencies to, and for what duration to limit it to. That's one example of a requirement, right? Another example of a requirement is what we are seeing from ERCOT about 2 weeks back, where they were talking about a 10 megawatt per 5-second limit. That's still undergoing a lot of stakeholder discussion, but those show you the two flavors of how these requirements can ultimately tie into being enforced in any of your interconnection guidelines. The last, if you can move to the next slide, please. I'll very quickly touch upon the rest. I think I'm not doing too great on time, but yeah, on the power quality side, these again are very standard. And so there's definitely a recommendation that the power quality requirements that exist for the existing customers get translated to the large load customers as well. We are seeing the same IEEE 519, the 1453, all of those standards being enforced across the board, across all of the utilities. There is, of course, a requirement, though, for more diligent kind of monitoring using power quality meters and more, given the type of load that you're dealing with, even moving to additional kind of more discrete metering to really help support this. If you can go to the next slide, please. Won't spend too much time on the power quality piece because across the board, if you look at it, it's the same type of requirements, at least just being enforced differently at the utility level versus at the ISO level through the utility interconnection studies. Now, one thing that I will say is that we are used to seeing kind of like the harmonic limits and all of those, but there's also the flicker limits, there's also rapid voltage change, which are also components of some of these IEEE standards. So they already exist within most of the interconnection requirements, I would say, but that's just something to keep in mind, that that's really what makes the whole thing more comprehensive. The last one that I'll just spend a few minutes on, if you can move to the next slide, please, is really this other category, right? And I mean, from the perspective of what other really means here, it's really what we need to think about to ensure that these requirements are being met or satisfied. So this calls for mandatory power quality monitoring, as well as digital fault recorders, as well as synchrophasers at a lot of locations in the system. There's a lot of coordination that is needed operationally, and especially if there is a need for, depending on how things turn out with large loads and all that, whether there's a need for more continuous monitoring of the forecasts for the next couple of days for these large loads. So clearly operational visibility, telemetry, all those are critical components, right? Now, another important piece as well that we are seeing is if you look at Southern Company and you look at LIPA, they include everything from what they refer to as planned data center models to as built data center models to as left data center models, which is really setting the stage for an entire commissioning energization process for data center loads, as you would see for other large load customers. I'm sorry, not large loads, but as you would see for other inverter-based resources, right? If you think about some of the other commissioning and energization requirements that we have to interconnect our inverter-based generators. So that's becoming a common theme now. And I think LIPA and Southern have done a great job in documenting some of those requirements. If you can move to the next slide, please. Great. This is again reiterating, and you'll see very common themes over here in what is being asked for in other regions in terms of the other category, which is really around performance-based enforcement, performance monitoring, model fidelity, commissioning and coordination, and really what type of mitigation to propose if the load behavior is kind of degrading your voltage stability or causing any damping issues. And so the LIPA requirement, for example, goes into asking for digital fault recorders and digital data recorders, which is really all your power quality phasers. There's discussion of waveform measurement units along with synchrophaser units. So this space is really trying to evolve into seeing what we can do best to be able to monitor the behavior that we are planning the system for going ahead. With this, actually, the next few slides that I have are really more informational. They deep dive into, I'd say, some of the more specific details that were discussed or summarized in some of these slides. And just added that to the mix here as well, so folks have all of that information in one location. But I'm going to pause here to see Wenchin, Ibrahim, anything to add or anything that I might have missed.
Thanks, Raul. This is Ibrahim. Thank you for going to slides. I don't know, Wenchin, if you have any comments or if there are any questions from others on the call. Thank you.
Right. Not at this point, Raul. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Rahul. That was a lot of information in a very short time. Thank you for getting through that. We have no hands in the queue. There are no questions in the chat. If anybody has questions or wants to raise your hand, we can always come back to something if you think of a question from here. And thank you, Merlin, our event producer. We're going to go to our main presentation. I think we're on page 17. We're on page 18 now. So we're going to start with the updates from the utilities. And Wenjin, I think we're starting with you for PG&E. And we'll start, you have a slide 1 here.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Wenchun Zhu. I'm with PG&E Transmission Planning. Next page, please. Just a quick update. Yeah, so this is kind of a quick overview, right? So of data center projects under contract or active study, right? So we have over 5 gigawatt on the contract and additional megawatts under active study. Yeah, next page, please. We certainly have a lot more in, yeah, so say inquiry stage, right? So several gigawatt also in inquiry queue. So PG&E, our first cluster study was in 2024, cluster 2024. It was a pilot study, cluster study for Bay Area. For 2025, last year, we also had a cluster study over entire PG&E footprint, also focusing on data center. This year, we opened the cluster study window, and then we expand beyond data center, right? So it's all large load interconnection over entire PG&E footprint. As mentioned, we also received inquiries. So there is more uncertainty, right? So we don't know whether they will stay, move on, or not. And then in our load interconnection process, we also have load inquiry studies, provide preliminary answers to customers' questions before they join any cluster study, right? So that's our study process right now, how it looks like right now. Next page, please. So we have established a study approach, like multi-phase study approach. The first is steady state analysis. And then we also have annual steady state power flow analysis, right? So identifying, so steady state analysis, we identify including identification of interconnection facilities and capacity upgrades required, right? So second phase is stability study, short circuit study, SSO screening, etc. Third one is power quality studies. We actually require customers to perform power quality studies like harmonic, transformer energization, etc. And we also, in phase 3, we also require PSCAD model. Phase 4 is additional studies, so case by case, right? Needs of these studies case by case. For example, detailed SSO if a phase 2 screening study identified issues. So detailed SSO study using PSCAD model could be needed, right? That's phase 4, in phase 4. We also established model requirements to support different phases of studies. So these include, NERC questionnaire, answers to NERC questionnaire, right? So very helpful information of customers' facilities could be included in, provided in NERC questionnaire. We also high-level single line diagram, require high-level single line diagram, dynamic data, PSCAD model, and also not listed here, short circuit data. So that's still being discussed and finalized. Okay, next page, please. Where is that? Okay, so technical requirements, right? So this is ongoing effort, so collaborating with CAISO and working with Denova Energy Solutions. So this was discussed a lot in much detail by Raul and also Abraham. And then we so actively discuss with CAISO and participate in CAISO's large load working group, exchange ideas with other PTOs. Additional requirements are being considered, right? So based on really so we reviewed NERC Alert 2 large load requirements, NERC Alert 2, right? So in there, NERC recommended POs should have a process for model verification and model validation. So this is being considered, and also high-speed recording. This is also recommended by NERC. So this is also being considered. So this is technical requirements. I think that's it for PG&E. Thank you.
We're going to go to Manuel Avendaño.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent. I want to turn on my camera as well. Hello, everyone. My name is Manuel Avendaño. I'm the Senior Manager of Central System Planning with Southern California Edison. I don't have any slides to present. My update will be verbal, given the limited information we are providing today. Most of the data center requests that we have received to date are seeking service at the subtransmission or distribution level, right? So they're primarily smaller in size. We have received, SE has received 5 applications requesting transmission level service for data center projects. Out of those 5, 1 advanced to the method of service study. That's our established process to handle this type of requests at this point. We completed the study and the results were provided to the customer. And at this time, the customer has not moved forward with a formal request for a transmission service. Having said that, we are working very actively with the CAISO large load working groups, right, to adopt these technical requirements and prepare for what we see is a growing number of inquiries that could turn into potential requests. That's my update, and I don't know if there's any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Manuel. Any questions in the queue? Good, thank you. I'm going to go to our next presentation, PG&E. I'm going to hand it over to Mehrdad Majidi.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Mehrdad Majidi, Transmission Planning Manager at SDG&E. I have a couple of slides regarding the data center development at SDG&E that I plan to present. Next slide, please. SDG&E has signed a study agreement with a couple of data center developments in the range of 1.7 gigawatt as of now. We are doing the load interconnection assessment for those requests, and they are looking for 24 to 36 months kind of in-service date after the utility engagement. That's basically very aggressive in-service date that they are looking for. We need to work with our internal business units to see how we can expedite our study process along with the kind of the construction process to meet their in-service date. As of now, SDG&E follows a transmission level interconnection study process to evaluate the available capacity across the transmission corridors that we have. And as a part of that study, in the system impact study agreement with the customer, we conduct different type of the studies, including thermal loading contingency analysis, voltage assessment, in the steady state and the post-transient, as well as cascading, dynamic stability study, and short circuit. We work with engineering partners to refine the technical assumptions and finding some kind of business models or the different type of the construction models to meet the data center implementation timelines. Next slide, please. As a part of the large load assessment challenges, I mean, the studies that we are doing for data centers, we have different challenges. One of the challenges that we have is related to the customer provided data. I mean, in order to get more accurate power flow and the dynamic models, they are in the earliest stage in the study plan. I mean, in the study phase, they may not have more accurate as-built models. So that's why, at least for the applications that we are working on, we use more generic models, including CMP EV1 and CMP MOT3, and with the parameters that were provided by CAISO to conduct different dynamic analysis and transient stability analysis. As of now, we haven't seen any significant model behavior as a part of the models that we have used in our PSLF studies and in the steady state and the dynamic transient stability analysis. But we work with CAISO hand in hand as a part of the working group to come up with the requirements and more accurate kind of methodology in order to conduct these type of the interconnection studies. And one of the observations that we found as a part of this study was related to the ramp rates, at least for the locations that we are working on, different point of interconnections with the data centers. We noticed that for sure the slower ramp rates typically prevent transient divergence and minimize oscillations. We are trying to play back some actual real-time data of in the industry for the data centers back to PSLF to see how the oscillations, voltage frequency look like after playing back those actual real-time data to the system. So that's basically the current status and the update from SDG&E. Please let me know if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mehrdad. We have no questions. We have no hands in the queue. The next station, go to number 7BA.
This is Daryl Holmes. Hi, this is Daryl Holmes from Valley Electric Association. Next slide, please. I'm the planning engineer for Valley, and wanted to just take a moment to point out that Valley's footprint, Valley Electric Association, is in Nevada. We are PTOs. In fact, we have 2 PTOs in our service territory. VEA owns the 138 kV transmission facilities under the CAISO's operational control, and Gridlines West owns the 230. Next slide, please. So why are data centers interested in VEA's area? I have a couple of single line diagrams here, but the main focus is if you look at the red lines on the left, that's the 230. And on the right, you can see the red lines greatly expanded, doubled and extending out to our Beatty area. And then blue lines indicate new 500 kV. These are called Gridlines core upgrades approved by the CAISO. So we have transmission expansion that makes data center applications attractive in our area. And then we also have on the bullets below, we have about 8 gigawatts of CAISO queued generation and 6 gigawatts of queued storage. Next slide, please. And here's our data center load queue. It's 2.6 gigawatts, and we have under 2 data centers. The first data center has a request for 1.6 gigs, the second one 1 gig. And I highlighted in red the ramping schedule, because what we're finding with data centers is other folks is there's a big data gap. Our data center one business model is like a landlord. They don't know who their tenants are going to be. So when you ask for load profiles, they raise their hand and say, I don't know. And as a planning engineer, I respond, well, we have to stress the grid, adequately. So I'm going to assume, data center tenants, heavily AI as to stress the system and protect our reliability under unknown data. So we also have those data centers, but we also filed with the CEC other large loads in our area, which is mining loads. And we have a lot more new residential commercial. And I've also included station load and power for all that generation that I mentioned in the 8 gigawatts of generation in the earlier slide. That actually adds significant amount of load, large load in our area. Both of these data centers want to connect to grid lines, transmission, 230 kV transmission bus at Gainbird. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the load update, in that we are studying data center one. It's in the system impact study stage. But what we see from the Large Load Technical Working Group and from FERC and NERC and this presentation today, our study tools are still being developed and our standards are still being developed. So we have a data center that wants to interconnect, as quickly as possible once Gridline's core upgrades are operating. And so my mind goes to, well, how can we connect this data center and meet not only future requirements by the CAISO, but the NERC. And so I'm raising the question of mitigation. Is there, we've seen that data centers are a unique type of load. We don't know the future customer, so there's load uncertainty. And I already mentioned that it's reasonable to assume not only a high worst case scenario, so AI data center loads for data centers that can't define their customers. And so the graphic on the left shows in the gray typical pulse rates and ramp rates of a AI data center. And then the green line indicates, well, what if you have a SATCOM, an eSATCOM, mitigating those pulse rate and ramp rates. And then you see the green curve. And so I'm raising the question, how should we, how should we consider mitigation in this interim gap when our study tools aren't fully developed yet? They're not, even when the tools are developed, say later this year or next year, and we have NERC and FERC standards, there's a validation process that follows that too, where you actually have your tools and you collect field data, real-time data, and you validate your tool. So so I think there's a role for looking at mitigation in the interim to meet future standards and also to ensure reliability of the grid. And so one of the things that you notice that our data center loads are very large, and they're going to require dynamic voltage support anyway. So one of the mitigating factors we're looking at, our mitigating tools, is eSATCOMs. And I believe that's all I had to say for an update. Next slide gives my contact information. That's it. Thank you.
so much. Thank you very much. No questions in the queue at this time.
We have a hand from TJ Vargas.
Curious, in general, what kind of size of megawatts or kW are we seeing in data centers? If anybody could comment about that. Sorry if this isn't, I could ask this later.
I'm sorry, was that a question to me? It was a little bit garbled on mine.
Yeah. I mean, in general, like, I'm just kind of curious on like how large these loads are.
The first data center is requesting up to 1,600 megawatts, so 1.6 gigawatts.
Oh,
Our
wow.
load, to give you perspective, VEA's load last year is about 150 megawatts, so pretty much 10 times our current load. But that will be supported with GridLiant's core upgrades that add a lot of 230 and some 500 kV in our area. And the second data center is 1,000 megawatts. So very large data centers, and they're concentrating on the same bus. And or that's their application for the POIs, Gainbird 230 kV bus, which will be challenging even for 1.6 megawatts, let alone another 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt. So that's the applications. That's what we're trying to study and understand, and also keep in mind the standards that are going to be forthcoming, not only from the Cal ISO, FERC, and NERC, but then what are our local requirements as well. So,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, we're in the same boat as most utilities here, but it's really exaggerated in our area because we're a small footprint, but we have very robust transmission system coming in to support large amounts of generation and storage. And now we have a data center R2 also to analyze. So
okay,
it's fun and challenging, but we're I'm really anxious to get the tools to adequately study these data center loads that are so unique to the transmission system. And so as a planning engineer, you'd love to have tools. I've seen the same growth through the PV industry. And so that's why I mentioned that, you know, the models will be eventually validated, the data center models. That's what we went through in the PV industry. And now interconnecting photovoltaics, IBRs, is fairly standard and confident that the grid's reliability is maintained. So we're a few years out from that, it appears, for the tools and the confidence level of the impact to the grid for these large data centers, especially AI data centers.
Okay, and just curious though, when you're saying 1,600 megawatts, is this over multiple locations, or is this just like one huge data center?
Yeah, typically how the data center is being proposed is in 100 megawatts to 150 megawatt buildings, but it will be one site, and that could be spread over 2 or 3 customer 230 kV substations, and then combine those and interconnect to GridLiant substation. So there is some parsing of the load, 100, 150 megawatt data center buildings. And then, you know, if it's 150 megawatts, then, you know, 10 plus a little bit. So 11 buildings for this data center one.
Are you guys going down from like 230 to like, you know, 12 kV, or is there like 2 sets of substations? Are you going to go from like 230 to 69 and the 69 to 12?
Yeah, the initial proposal of the customer, yeah, they're going to start with 230, and then they want to go down to 34.5. But that's to be negotiated too in the future, because VEA's distribution voltage is 29 kV, 26.5 kV. So, but there will be a conversion from 230 to a lower distribution voltage.
Okay,
Yes, to be worked out. But for our modeling and for system impact study stage, we're focusing on the impacts on the transmission grid. So that's
okay.
230
So
to
in general,
130.
though, there will end up being 2 different substations.
Yeah, there'll be currently proposed for data center 1 is 3 230 kV substations, and then 8 or 10, well, a handful of 150 megawatt buildings off of that will transform down to 34.5 kV, and then building voltage.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, very good. Thanks for the question.
And TJ, I had cut you off at the introduction part, so that was TJ Vargas of DWR. I don't see any other hands. Thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to go to the next. Hand it over to Danielle to next.
Thanks, everyone. So just wanted to kind of recap some of the next steps. I really appreciate all the input that we received in the updates from the utilities and everyone today. Thanks, Ibrahim, for spearheading this effort. We are going to continue to have discussions with state agencies and local regulatory authorities around not just the technical requirements that we're exploring, but also any potential policy proposals that we put forward in the straw proposal that, again, we plan to post in early April of 2026. So just about a month. We're also having these continued discussions with PTOs and utilities regarding the development of technical requirements. I do want to add that this is part of, as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a broader stakeholder initiative. So we are not exclusively taking feedback from just the entities that presented today. We have reasons for working closely with them on the technical requirements, but we do want this to be a process that all utilities and load serving entities and large load customers and other stakeholders have input into. And so we'll take that input not only in terms of in the form of comments from today's workshop, but also as we move through the broader stakeholder initiative, and we'll go through that in the same way that we do all of our standard initiatives as well. So very open to additional feedback from any other parties on this. Of course, we're monitoring FERC's consideration of large loads and co-located loads and generation, and looking at what other ISOs and RTOs are doing there. We're also monitoring, and we discussed quite a bit today, some of the NERC actions on the development of technical requirements, and are making sure that we're providing input to that, and also thinking through the information that comes through from those processes out to the ISO and from other external processes and task forces as well. And as I mentioned, we're working toward a straw proposal that will include some of this information on the technical requirements in April of 2026. Next slide, please.
So much.
Yeah,
Okay,
thank you.
so the comments on this due in 2 weeks by end of day on March 24th through the commenting tool initiative webpage links below. The updated slides will also get posted by end of day today. That will include all the slides presentations today, just combined into that. If you have any questions, you can email us at .com, and we can route those to. Next slide, please. And in an effort to help you stay engaged with the various California ISO activities and initiatives, here is the Matters blog. And if you'd like to subscribe to this and automatically receive this in your inbox, there. So, Office of Stakeholder Affairs, thank you to all our presenters today. Thank you for pulling all this material together and sharing with us. Thank you for everybody that was here attending. Thank you to our event producers, and we can now conclude this call.